all of the identifiers that constitute special categories, you need to memorize what they constitute under statute. Hello and welcome back to Privacy Professional Training. My name is Fumi Owolabi. Today's video, we're going to be looking at some of the themes that are under review for the Domain 2 for the CIPP exam. So the CIPP exam is the Certified Information Privacy Professional Exam for Europe. It's offered by the IAPP. Today's video, we're going to be looking at themes discussed in Domain 2 that you're going to encounter, and I personally always found it very valuable to have examples, particularly if this is your first privacy exam. So without further ado, Domain 2 looks a lot at the GDPR. Now, if you have never reviewed or heard of the GDPR, it is an incredibly important, comprehensive privacy legislation that influences lots of different organizations in the European Union. Now, there is a little bit of a caveat, and when we look at things like law enforcement, there is a bit of a caveat with the GDPR, but the basis of Domain 2 is looking at some of these foundational principles. Now, we're going to be looking at things like scope and applicability. If you are brand new to privacy, I will say that the CIPP exam, in my opinion, is very statute heavy, so there is going to be a component of memorization that's going to be required if you do not have a legal background like myself. So I will say that the fortunate thing about data protection and the privacy program as a whole is there are several different roles that you can play. I still think it's valuable to take the CIPP exam because it is so influential on organizations even outside of the United States. I must say for myself and my own practice, I constantly do a lot of work that has influences from the European Union, even though I am a US-based attorney. So this is going to be incredibly important if you're studying for this test to understand scope and applicability and what the statute dictates. So my hope in discussing the Domain 2 is to give examples. I think it's valuable to have examples when you are studying for the test because it helps you conceptualize terms that you're going to need to know. If you look at the body of knowledge, there's lots of different ways that you can be tested on the CIPP exam. It may be that you're not going to encounter word for word what the statute dictates. You're going to need to be able to read, comprehend, and be able to apply that when you're looking at these questions. Let's talk about terminology. Probably the most important term you're going to need to know as a privacy pro is what constitutes personal data. Personal data is any information that can identify an individual either directly or indirectly. Now, this is incredibly important and key, and I'm going to go into detail as to why. So if you are new to privacy and you're not familiar with how all-encompassing and broad that definition is, pay careful attention to terms that you're going to encounter as you review your study materials, because not only does personal data identify you directly, meaning your name. When we started this video, I identified myself, Fumi Owolabi, and you can see my face, right? So you know who I am. That is a direct understanding of personal data. Now, if you have a particular tool and you go onto the internet, and actually, I'll give a very good example of indirect information that can identify an individual. So I've already directly identified myself. I gave you my name and you can see my face. But indirect personal data are things like IP address or metadata logs. If you have access to certain applications and systems, you can use certain identifiers to place a person. And I'll give a good example of that. My computer, right? My computer has its own IP address, as does my internet. So I have an IP address associated with the internet I use in my house. If you have a particular system or application and you put the IP address and you know where I live, or you're very tech savvy and you're able to identify that IP address, you can identify this is Fumi's home based off of that IP address if you have certain tools and applications. But you've been able to identify now where I live because you have that IP address. Now the IP address is not my name, but indirectly it's an identifier that provides you information about me, which is why it constitutes personal data. And hopefully throughout this video, we're also going to see the terminology associated with things like pseudonymous data, incredibly important, and is definitely going to not only impact your understanding of what constitutes personal data for the test, but in your practice as a privacy professional in any capacity. I think something, and I'm just going to mention this and it's outside of Domain 2, but I just thought of it. There are very sophisticated technologies now that are coming out with certain identifiers that on its face don't look like personal data, like a name, but they can be used to identify an individual. And I think a great example of this is behavioral data. Now, we're not going to get too much into that. We're talking about domain 2 today. If you would like to discuss behavioral data, you can send me an email. So let's talk about direct identifiers. Direct identifiers: name, non-biometric photo, email address, home address. Let's talk a bit about the distinction between personal data and what the GDPR constitutes as a special category of personal data. We've got personal data, which I just talked about, and then we've got something called special categories. Now, the statute makes a distinction because what is considered a special category of personal data requires heightened safeguards or additional safeguards by organizations. Now, you as a privacy pro, you're going to need to know this, not only for the test, but also in your practice. So an example of a special category would be biometric data or information about an individual that ties them to trade union membership. So taking a look at understanding what constitutes biometric data, you're going to need to be able to understand that concept. Understanding what trade union membership looks like, knowing that as well. All of the identifiers that constitute special categories, you need to memorize what they constitute under statute. Let's talk about some of the principles that are associated with the legislation overall. Now, in domain 1, I talked a little bit about transparency and purpose limitation. A couple additional extra principles that you're going to encounter through the review of the GDPR is data minimization. Only collecting data that is minimally required for the activity that you're going to do. And we're going to continue looking at concepts. There are a lot of concepts to cover in the GDPR. And a lot of the themes from the GDPR have been adopted and accommodated in US legislation and statute that's been coming out. We've seen an increase in US state privacy legislation in the last, I would say, 6-7 years. And I believe that a lot of the influences on that US state privacy legislation comes from different concepts that originate from the GDPR. Let's look at security and its relationship with data protection. So I've done many videos about the relationship that us as privacy pros have to our security counterparts. We work very often in tandem. I want to talk about the discussion of technical and organizational measures as it pertains to the GDPR. So there's a provision in statute that requires organizations to have technical and organizational measures that safeguard personal data, right? Our original idea is to make sure that personal data is processed in a particular manner. But in doing so, we've got to safeguard it. And we're going to talk about the influence of security and how our work as privacy pros overlaps with our security counterparts. And in some cases, depending on the risk posture and tolerance of an organization, we can actually end up doing a lot more security work than the privacy work because there is a requirement under statute to have these technical measures. I've talked a lot about, taking the CISSP exam. If you're interested in taking that cert, just take a look at my channel. I have lots of videos about taking that CISP exam, but I want to talk about what technical measures may look like, what organizational measures may look like. You need to be able to have a very quick understanding of what is technical and what would be an organizational measure. So a technical measure that could be encountered, for example, in an organization is access controls. This is huge. Access controls are measures that are put in place to ensure that individuals only have access to systems, repositories, applications that they need that are required to fulfill a specific function. Now, I put that very broadly because so many things are context dependent, but I think an incredibly great example of this is if you are a HR professional within an organization, the access that you are going to have to personal data is going to be more regarding employees than what a sales professional may have access to. Distributing access to certain systems based on job role. Now, that is just an example. There's lots of different ways to distribute access controls within an organization. But not only are you going to need to be able to understand that technical measures may need to be put in place, you're going to need to be able to understand what constitutes a technical measure and its distinction from an organizational measure. So let's look at organizational measures. Organizational measures could be making sure that employees conduct training. That is not a technical measure, but it is a measure to ensure that employees understand, one, how they need to process personal data with respect to their job function, and two, different elements of your own privacy program within the organization that employees need to know about, because they're the ones that are going to be processing personal data day by day. We've got HR professionals that process employee data. We've got sales professionals that process customer data. Not having that employee privacy training is going to potentially have a detrimental impact to the organization as a whole, because it's employees that process personal data day to day. So there's a lot to cover in domain 2. There's a lot to understand in terms of terminology. For my own studies, I've done videos on how I passed this cert myself. So if you want to take a look at that, you can look at the videos that I've done in the past. But what I do want to say about understanding the statute specifically for CIPP and for this domain, because it is very, very terminology heavy, is to use scribed. I always like to use flashcards. And the other thing that I do is I like to take many, many question papers. So I actually created my own questions. If you would like to purchase those, you can go on Amazon and purchase them from there, or you can go to the website. But I think it's going to be really important to reinforce your understanding of what the statute requires of organizations, what the provisions actually mean, and applying them. And so in applying them, it's valuable to do several different questions so you can see the term being applied in different scenarios. It may be a scenario that tests your understanding of the term. It may be your understanding of seeing it in practice in an organization or in your role as a privacy professional. So I really hope you enjoyed my breakdown of some of the themes that are discussed in the body of knowledge for Domain 2. If you are interested in purchasing any of the questions that I have personally created, you can take a look on Amazon. If you have questions about resources that I personally use to pass the test, you can send me an email or leave a comment below and I will definitely answer it. I hope you enjoyed this video and I hope to see you in another domain review.